You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Well, Dr. Cornel West moves to the Green Party in his 2024 presidential run, and he says this means when it comes to infrastructure and institution, it's much broader and deeper, access to the ballot much broader, but in the end, as you know, any candidacy to run the empire in order to dismantle the empire has to be part of a movement. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
He says, we're not talking about hating anybody. We're talking about loving. We're talking about affirming. We're talking about empowering those who have been pushed to the margins because neither party wants to tell the truth about Wall Street, Ukraine, about the Pentagon, about big tech. You know, Dr. Horne, that's a hard position to argue with. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, as you know more than most, I have enormous respect for Professor West. He's one of the towering intellectuals of our time, but certainly he's carved out for himself a very difficult position. What I mean is your introductory remarks suggested, there is no accident that there is this duopoly, this so-called two-party system that seeks to squeeze out opposition parties. You have the Democratic Party, which at the highest level is dominated by finance capital. And then you have a Republican Party, which has membership of all wings of capital, not to mention a substantial base amongst the Euro-American working class and middle class. However, as you know, I have a residence in Texas. I vote in Texas. And the Republicans have a stranglehold on Texas. And we also know that the U.S. presidential election is not a single election. You can get the most votes and still lose, as Hillary Rodham Clinton could well attest. It's 50-plus different elections. And going back to Texas, it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to prevail in Texas. And I'd say that to those who say that Dr. West's race will help to throw the race to the Republicans. Well, the Republicans have a stranglehold on Texas already. He cannot do that. And obviously what the Democrats have been offering in Texas has not been attractive to a majority of the voters. So with regard to the state of Texas, I welcome Cornel West visiting Texas and campaigning. I will probably host him there. And you can fairly say that for a overwhelming majority of the U.S. jurisdictions, that we already know who's going to prevail. It's clear that Mr. Biden will prevail in California. It's clear that Mr. Biden will prevail in Washington, D.C. It's clear that the Republicans will prevail in most of Dixie, that is to say Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and the Rocky Mountain states such as Idaho and Utah, for example. So I wish that those who would throw stones at Cornel West for having the gumption to throw his hat into the ring would really study the U.S. electoral system, the electoral college not least, and recognize that his race has the potential to build a movement that could at least have substantial impact in a place like Texas, in a place like Louisiana, in a place like Mississippi.
You know, one of the things they're saying, you know, it's going to affect the Democrats, that he's effectively stealing votes from the Democrats, right? He's in a different party. My argument has been that, well, then you might as well argue that Donald Trump is stealing votes from the Democrats, that the person in the Socialist Party is stealing the Democrats. If you can argue that someone in another party is stealing your votes, then you can argue that all parties are stealing your votes. But in order for someone to take your votes, that means you have to have ownership and claim them, that somebody else doesn't have a right to run. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly, Professor West, if any U.S. citizen has this right, he has the right to run. And I think that some of our friends on the left, as I've indicated in my previous remarks, they haven't done a serious analysis of the U.S. electoral system or the electoral college. I think that they use this excuse that third parties take votes away from the Democrats as an excuse for not challenging the Democrats. I mean, for example, if you go back to 2000, when it was charged that Ralph Nader and the Greens had thrown the election to George W. Bush. Well, Al Gore, the Democratic nominee, did not win his own home state of Tennessee. If he had won Tennessee, the close vote in Florida, which we are told helped to tip the race to George W. Bush, would not have mattered. He also did not do well in Arkansas, where his former running mate, Bill Clinton, was supposedly the major domo. So at least what I hope emerges from this 2024 race is a more honest assessment, a more accurate assessment, a more historically grounded assessment of U.S. presidential politics and U.S. electoral politics. And I would hope that our friends on the left who use this excuse that you can't run because it throws the election to the Republicans would finally come to realize that that's just a wan and impure excuse for not having the gumption to throw down and challenge monopoly capital.
He says, and I mentioned this in the open, any candidacy to run the empire in order to dismantle the empire has to be part of a movement. He also talks about the influence that the Black Panther Party in Sacramento, California had on him. He references Frantz Fanon. I mean, he's making a number of references that I don't think I've ever heard another presidential candidate make. So talk about that in the context of this is movement politics versus party politics.
Well, we have come to expect that sort of insight and crystalline intelligence from Professor West. And certainly you are correct to suggest that it is not ordinary and common for presidential candidates to invoke the Black Panther Party or Frantz Fanon for that matter. And what that bespeaks is the point that there are many of us who are basically disenfranchised. That is to say, we are not allowed to have a voice with regard to presidential politics, which means we fundamentally do not have a vote. And Dr. West is stepping forward and trying to voice the sentiments of the disenfranchised. And we should come to expect in a nation like this that as a result, we will be stoned by the unforgiving and denounced by the ignorant.
French President Macron seeks invitation to Brics summit amid shifting foreign policy and Ukraine conflict. You know, one of the things that I've heard put forth is that President Putin's going to be there, and that he won't answer the phone for anyone in NATO. And one of the main reasons he wants to be there is because he wants an opportunity to talk to President Putin. I don't know if that's true, but I heard that as one of the possibilities. Anyway, your thoughts about Macron and Brics?
You know, this is a very tricky proposition to contemplate. I would like to sit in on the meetings of the leadership of the African National Congress and their South African Communist Party ally. Because on the one hand, you could easily dismiss this as grandstanding by President Macron, yet another futile and frantic search for headlines. You could also see it as opportunism. That is to say, France knows that its pretensions to be a major power, it's its neo-colonial role in Africa, which the rise of South Africa and the Brics is challenging. But at the same time, those of us who know a thing or two about France recognize that at one point, France withdrew from the military wing of NATO. We know that before the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, France had done so. And this might be a possibility if he is invited to the summit to drive a wedge into the group of seven, the United States, Canada, Japan, and the Western European nations. We know that France historically has played the role of the maverick in terms of the predatory Western European powers going back, in fact, to the 16th century, when as an ostensibly Catholic power, it was willing and able to cut deals with Muslim Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, which was then seen as the sort of bête noire, pardon the expression, by the Christian power, so-called. So we would have to think about very carefully how we should respond to President Macron. Although if you press me, I would say that we should file his request in the circular file. That is to say, he doesn't merit an adequate response.
And to that point, it's reported that the Brics countries, they haven't officially responded, and that many believe that they're not enthusiastic about it, and that many of them believe that if he were to come, that it would undermine their identity and cohesion. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, it's like allowing a spy to come into the highest councils. Mr. Macron is slippery, and that's one reason why we should not trust him. However, I think that if the leadership in Pretoria call for my advice, I would say to string him along, to ask him what he would like to offer in this meeting, perhaps to send a memorandum outlining his proposal, why he wants to come, etc., and then have that leaked to the press in order to drive a further wedge into the group of seven.
Former military man Douglas McGregor has an interesting article, Democratic Backsliding. The Biden administration is subjugating its opponents at home and overseas. And Witzy gets into some very interesting thoughts on foreign policy. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, McGregor is a very interesting character. He is a erstwhile comrade of Donald J. Trump, yet he is also a very stern critic of the escapade in Ukraine. He's a very stern critic of Victoria Nuland, the State Department honcho, who is one of the hawks with regard to Ukraine. It's interesting that, as ever in the United States, the hawks militarily are to be found at the State Department, where those who pay the ultimate price, the Pentagon, are oftentimes more dovish. So Mr. McGregor, Colonel McGregor, to use his formal title, is a man whose opinions we should pay attention to, not least because of his close ties to the Republican right and the ability, once again, to drive a wedge into the highest ranks of the U.S. ruling elite and those who help to shape U.S. foreign policy.
And when you read this piece and understand that it's published in the American Conservative, who do you think his audience is here?
Well, look at the New York Times today. There's an article about how the Republican Party is framed with regard to more aid for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. As we have said more than once, the basic split in the U.S. ruling class right now is between the Trumpista wing, which would like to cut a deal with Moscow in order to focus like a laser beam on China, and the heedless Biden wing, which wants to confront both Beijing and Moscow, which is a fool's errand at best, will only end in tears. And I think Mr. McGregor, Colonel McGregor, is a realist. Those who he is speaking to in the American Conservative are realists as well. And I think that undergirds his words in that journal.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.